We now have approximately half an hour for questions, for comments, for discussion.
I want to thank the speakers on this very important subject, and the cri de coeur of Justice Murnane, which of course alerted us to what I called the condition of life-death in a very real sense in my lecture. The question I want to ask you as a lone literary figure amongst eminent justices is the following. As justices impassioned by Fratelli Tutti and the other encyclicals of Pope Francis, you fight injustices from the court bench. And you do that with great sincerity. However, when the people of the world want to fight their injustices, which are not only for fundamental human rights, this is for the fundamental interests of life itself, of being able to live, of bread and butter and chapati, or whatever the bread is in your language and in your culture. Their forms of resistance are often deemed to be illegal. They're often deemed to be breaking the bounds of legality. The reason why I focus so much on my reading, and it was my reading, of the Holy Father's views was because he is able to see things from both sides. He is not like the leaders in many of our countries who talk loud and big and then immediately shut down the debate when it comes to the people by saying, you acted illegally, you broke a window, you had no right, you should have sat there silent. Now, the interpretation of a large public roiled by injustice is very different from the fight from the bench of the court. How do you, as international justices, think about the boundaries of the people's fight for justice? What do you feel should not be breached? Is it just a formula that people should follow the law of the land? When, as you were saying, and as a lot of people feel, and as I showed in my talk yesterday, as soon as people who have real need and constitutional rights on their side in immigration, they're immediately stopped by other means. Some of them are extra-legal means, some of them are intra-legal means, and then they're enraged. They have done everything that they need to do. And yet the Trump administration delays, as we know, delays as much an injustice as anything else. How do you judges feel about the limits of public protest when you yourselves are fighting the same war?
Jane, would you like to take that answer?
Thank you. I'll do my best. And just, if right, and I'll start again by saying my comments are my own and not an official. capacity so that I can continue to be on the bench and fight those things that you discussed. So I think that it's very important to separate our opportunity under the codes of judicial conduct to speak in public fora to help improve the situation and the limitations on what we're able to do when we are actually on the bench. We are not, in our roles, in our judicial roles, permitted to change the law. We are required to adjudicate the law as it exists. And that is that is part of what makes the judges in this room so extraordinary, in my view, because they deal with that, notwithstanding their personal conflict about how they may feel the law is unjust. They cannot stand up and say, I've decided that the immigration law is unjust, so y'all come on in. They can't do that. Judges cannot do that. But we can, under the codes of judicial conduct that I operate under, come to public forums like this to point out the issues that remain in the law and may warrant pressure from academics who are also in this room, legislators who those academics and judges may be in touch with, to seek to modify the law and remedy the pain that the law as it exists is causing. So it's that extraordinary challenge of staying within the bounds of the code of conduct when you are on the bench, but doing those things that you are permitted to do to help educate and inform the public as part of your role as a public official on the bench, that you have to walk that fine line, which led to my comments at the very beginning. I also will say, I had the opportunity for 8 years to work at the United Nations in addition to my US judicial role. And so I worked at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia for 5 years, and for 3 years at the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. So I have seen the entire range of remedies under the common law, under the international law, now under the law of the Marshallese, which includes customary law. And I have a good sense that by continuing to educate and inform, I dare say that most of the people in this room probably had no clue about the Marshall Islands before I came in today. And I made it my point to make sure that you didn't leave this room without knowing their plight. And hopefully you will extrapolate that to all of the island nations, because they suffer the same way. And that's what I think we as judges can do, Professor Baba, because I don't think that we can change the law, even if we wish we could.
Thank you, and it's duly registered that the opinions are your own and not as a representative of the Marshall Islands. Thank you. El colega, el doctor Buenaventura, por favor.
Thank everyone. Yes, Professor Justin, I think following on Professor Baba just said, I think that we are confined injustice in general in institutions to go after the consequences because we cannot address the causes. For instance, we have been dealing here on many activities, on former tribunals for Yugoslavia, Lebanon, and so on, and I praise the judge for that role. But we know that American imperialism, US imperialism, has been such a detrimental universal force to liquidate and kill all the initiatives in the world for independence, for sovereignty, and all these interventions. And I think this US imperialism is the elephant in the room here. And I think that we should address that issue as well. When we look at this, then I think that if in fact we are ready to address the causes, then probably we have to see that justice is politics by other means. If it is so, we should admit the politics of the judiciary. And the first thing would be precisely to see that, for instance, in this country where we are now, for many, many years, there were three associations of judges: the Communist Association, the Social Democrat Association, and the Conservative Association. Why there were three associations? Because they really felt that the interpretation of law is a political act. And there are very different interpretations of the law. For instance, the right to life is a higher right than the right to property. Well, if it is higher, then many of your judgments should be nullified in constitutional terms, because the priority or the primacy of the right to life should really prevail, and it doesn't prevail all the time. We know today in the financial markets that, in fact, what prevails is the right to property and investment. So, should we address that? I think you should. And if you do that, then I think, for instance, Professor Justin, Justin, I enjoyed very much your talk. Really, frankly, and I think usually we separate. You know, yesterday I was talking about the intercultural nature of our knowledges, and I think that we need an ecology of knowledge, as I call it. I mean, we have to start dialogues between science and other knowledges. Because, for instance, you cannot, in scientific terms, justify that a river has a spirit. Because in science, it is impossible to conceive of the spirituality of a river. So we have really entertained dialogues with other knowledge that are outside. And if we do that, then your land and land loss is also loss of life. I'd like to see whether your very sophisticated computing projects can also tell you that the loss of land goes along with the loss of life. What was the loss of life during this year? If the loss of life was that serious, probably is even more serious, then the United States today is a colony that has to be decolonized, actually, because it has not been decolonized yet. I would say.
Briefly, there's a timing, and I have a long list. So let's ask brief, pithy questions, please. Do you want to respond? And then I have la profesora Irigoyen. Justin, do you want to answer quickly?
Completely agree. And as I mentioned, science can never quantify, the depth of social and cultural trauma. But as you note too, integrating the cultural value of land, and I'm not sure you can quantify that. We've discussed that. But I think what we're really trying to do is contribute fundamental knowledge, about the factors that produce these current burdens and risks, and it can be attributed, as you mentioned, to their prior national policies and U.S. imperialism. I'm not sure we can fully quantify, and you can't really do that with the inherent value of a river, the spiritual value of a river. So I'm not sure. Methodologically, that's impossible, I think. But I'm with you. That's as or more important.
Thank you so much, Justin. La profesora Irigoyen, por favor. Luego, la jueza Figueredo, la doctora Ana María, la jueza Tostes y Andrés.
Agradeciendo las ponencias, les quiero plantear una pregunta especialmente al profesor Justin. ¿Cómo plantear y articular los derechos ambientales y el concepto de bien común sin que ello pueda ser utilizado para disminuir los derechos de los pueblos indígenas a la propiedad y titulación de sus territorios ancestrales? Sé que el concepto de propiedad territorial no era indígena, pues ellos no se sienten propietarios de los bosques para venderlos, etcétera, sino que se sienten parte del bosque. Pero en la práctica, si los bosques no son titulados a favor de los pueblos indígenas, el Estado los titula a favor de terceros, da concesiones forestales u otras, o los titula como áreas naturales protegidas, aparentemente para el bien común, que en la práctica significan desposesión indígena y es otra forma de colonialismo. Gracias.
Justin, rather than addressing the questions now, and Professor Kirshen, we're going to take all the questions, and then you can do a brief la jueza Figueredo, la jueza Ana María y la jueza Tostes, por favor.
Es un tema que tiene un todo que ver con la cultura y el desarrollo humano. Es un asunto de supervivencia humana y de soberanía alimentaria. El acceso al agua potable y las condiciones de vida en muchos lugares del mundo son insalubres. Baste con ver Haití, Somalia y otros sitios. Hoy en día, y ahí va mi pregunta, pues se generan grandes desastres naturales impulsados por el hombre. ¿Cómo contrarrestar? Colombia tiene Amazonía, Suramérica hace parte de la Amazonía. ¿Cómo contrarrestar que el 38% de los bosques de la Amazonía están degradados? ¿Cómo controlar los incendios y las sequías? Y aquí quiero precisar un aspecto que me parece trascendental y es que los impulsores y los impactos de degradación del bosque y del Amazonas se enfoca en 4 aspectos: sequías extremas, efectos del borde resultantes de fragmentación del hábitat, extracción de madera e incendios forestales. A este elemento se suma la deforestación en sus 2 elementos, la pérdida de biodiversidad y la liberación de carbono a la atmósfera. Un punto, y esta es mi pregunta: la construcción de represas corta la conectividad de los ríos, impidiendo las migraciones de las especies acuáticas y el normal flujo de nutrientes. ¿Cómo contrarrestar entonces el desarrollo, entendido como el avance que tenemos y que entre comillas se llama civilidad de los pueblos, con la degradación de la naturaleza que pone en riesgo la misma supervivencia humana y la soberanía alimentaria? Esto incrementado por el desconocimiento de los derechos de quienes generan agua y comida, el derecho de acceso y a la titulación de la tierra. Gracias.
La jueza Ana María Figueroa, por favor.
Gracias. Como aquí se analizó correctamente, el cambio climático es una realidad y desde el protocolo de Palermo en adelante se trató de instrumentar los derechos ambientales. Se advierte sobre el peligro que estamos cursando en este planeta, donde es probable que no sabemos los tiempos, pero se va acortando la posibilidad de vida si seguimos con estas actuaciones, con las industrias extractivas en el sistema capitalista, donde vemos, por ejemplo, en nuestro país, cómo hay extracciones de la tierra, cómo se contaminan para obtener el oro, los ríos navegables, los ríos de montañas, las aguas, como bien se han planteado aquí. Y el tema es que los protocolos existen, pero los países que más contaminan, como es Estados Unidos, no los firman ni los cumplen. El capitalismo elige obtener ganancias sin tomar en cuenta el riesgo de vida que tenemos todo el planeta. Y aquí se ha planteado qué hacer los jueces. La mayoría de nuestros países tiene ratificado el Pacto Internacional de Derechos Económicos, Sociales y Culturales. El artículo 1 del pacto plantea el derecho de la autodeterminación de los pueblos, el derecho sobre los recursos naturales, el derecho que tienen los pueblos a no menoscabar sus recursos que pueden producir hambre, miseria, exclusiones. Yo creo que lo que tenemos que cambiar es la mentalidad de los jueces acerca de cómo aplicamos el derecho. Y en este sentido, tenemos que tener claro que las normas de derecho internacional de los derechos humanos tienen jerarquía por encima de las normas de derecho interno. Y tenemos que ser rigurosos en hacer el test de convencionalidad y su aplicación y en consecuencia fallar siempre a favor de los pueblos, de las sociedades, de la vida, con un criterio ya no solo de respeto a las normas en el sentido liberal clásico, sino con una idea de supervivencia planetaria. Este es un poco la propuesta, ¿no? El cambio cultural y de formación, la ruptura epistemológica que tenemos que tomar en cuenta los jueces para aplicar adecuadamente el derecho como uno de los instrumentos. Y sabemos que el derecho frente al capitalismo muchas veces perdemos, pero no obstante ello tenemos que hacer el esfuerzo. Aquí hay muchos ejemplos, incluso el colega Gallardo tuvo serias dificultades ante la prensa cuando falló aplicando derechos de las sociedades en nuestro país cuando se planteaban cuestiones sobre las tarifas, sobre aguas, etcétera. Pero bueno, ese es el riesgo que tenemos que llevar adelante y no es un tema de valentía personal, es un tema de estricta aplicación del derecho. Gracias.
Gracias. La jueza Tostes Isoni, por favor, tiene la palabra.
Bom dia a todos e todas. Professor Justin, eu não pude deixar de observar que, além do senhor ser um estudioso de mudanças climáticas, estuda também classes sociais. E no Brasil, nós temos um grande ambientalista que foi assassinado, acho que era Chico Mendes, e que era também um grande líder sindical, um grande líder dos trabalhadores, né? Me chama muita atenção que os grandes acidentes ambientais, eles normalmente são também acidentes de trabalho. Nós temos grandes exemplos no Brasil, a maior tragédia ambiental do Brasil em Mariana, até então a maior tragédia ambiental do Brasil em Mariana, se deu por meio do rompimento de uma barragem. Então, portanto, também um acidente de trabalho, né? Em seguida, alguns anos depois, tivemos o acidente também numa barragem em Brumadinho, um grande impacto ambiental e social. Mas não é uma situação que fica restrita ao Brasil. Nós temos o caso de Chernobyl na Ucrânia, na Índia, em 84, o acidente envolvendo uma fábrica de pesticidas e, portanto, também um acidente de trabalho. A minha pergunta é: que caminhos o senhor vê nessa interação entre questões trabalhistas e de empoderamento dos trabalhadores, participação de trabalhadores e trabalhadoras no processo de tomada de decisão, inclusive em relação ao processo produtivo e à segurança do trabalho, o impacto na segurança também da comunidade, e questões de impacto ambiental, no sentido de assegurar, então, de forma mais democrática, a segurança de todos e todas. Muito obrigada.
Very brief responses, and if Professor Kirshen would like to add.
Well, thank you for all these questions. I'll try to respond by blending them all together. I think one motive of this project is to support tribal self-determination, sovereignty, and land rematriation, or land back, as we call it in the U.S. And so as they make their claims to the colonial power, which is the United States federal government, there's a pragmatic effort here in that recognizing the premise that the use, or enforcement, as was mentioned in one of the comments or questions, the use or enforcement of boundaries has been a practice and an outcome of colonial control, right? And so even using those is part of the colonial process. And with that said, I think to support tribal sovereignty and self-determination, one way, which is just one way of many, is to engage with the highly bureaucratic West and an epistemological colonial project that only recognizes certain forms of evidence and certain forms of truth. And we think our data can help with this and help engage that. But again, it's just one of many pathways, including, which also would include protests or more subversive direct action to support decolonializing efforts and to support tribal sovereignty. But here in this paper, and even in the journal we chose which to publish, it was to speak the language of the highly bureaucratic, highly rationalized West, and to participate in this epistemological colonial project that only recognizes forms of truth. And we think there's power in that.
Yeah, I just like to add that many factors have been brought up to be considered. You know, workplace safety, security, food security, land rights issues. All these can be considered in planning for climate change. You know, if you have the right set of team members, you can consider all these factors, and they must be considered. We must go beyond pure economic analysis, looking only at dollars. We must consider all these human factors as well in dealing with our climate change threats.
Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Judge Gallardo. Le doy la palabra al juez Gallardo. But before, I'd like to again thank Judge Murnane and Judge, perhaps the motto that flows from climate change and the geologic impacts, perhaps the motto mimics the last words of a citizen of the United States, George Floyd, as he was being murdered. I can't breathe. No puedo respirar. Judge Andrés.
Gracias. No, me quedé pensando en la pregunta del profesor Baba sobre el rol de los jueces, ¿no? Una muy buena pregunta para este ámbito. Y frente a estas situaciones de daño ambiental. Y son situaciones en las cuales en general son unos pocos los que depredan y somos los habitantes de la tierra y la propia tierra las víctimas de esa depredación. Y los que depredan tienen la capacidad económica para comprar medios de comunicación, para comprar políticos, para sobornar gobiernos y de alguna manera, en el llamado del Papa, nosotros somos el último bastión que queda para poner un límite a esa asimetría y a esa irracionalidad. Entonces, no hay ninguna obligación de aplicar una ley injusta. O sea, la ley injusta tiene que ser abolida, tiene que ser derogada, tiene que ser no cumplida, y esa es nuestra misión. Y no es alzarnos, sino justamente lo que decía la doctora Figueroa, reconocer que en el sistema normativo, no solo en el derecho natural, sino en el sistema normativo positivo, la norma suprema es la que defiende la vida y la que defiende la vida en la tierra. Entonces, ninguna norma inferior puede ser considerada válida si es injusto y se contrapone contra esa norma superior. Es una invitación a la reflexión para todos los colegas, porque esa es la naturaleza de nuestro llamado aquí en este lugar. No más espacio para leyes injustas.
Thank you so much. We now have Eminence. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to assure Linda, Judge Linda, that the dicastery of the Holy See pretty much understands the situation in the Marshall Islands. We were once in Honolulu for Red Mass. You know, that's the way they begin their parliament. And we made a delegation from Marshall Island who came talking about how they lamented that compensation payments and all of that were still, not forthcoming and lacking, and sought the help of the Holy See, if they could provide us some. So the situation is pretty much, thanks.
Thank you, Eminence.